Mhm.
What is unique about this COVID pandemic, and what aspects of it are actually kind of a repeat of things that happened 100 years ago? And so we
Mhm.
could think about what is unique compared to, say, 100 years ago, which was uh, the last pandemic on this scale, but not certainly. There's been other ones. We could talk about other ones in the 20th century as well. And we have time, we'll maybe get to those. But if you think about this one, what's been unique, so what's the first time, is that this happens with the kind of global connectivity that we have. So the media is reporting on it much quicker, although, in some
Mhm.
parts of the world, it took a couple months for us to really understand. And the global economy is much more connected, so it's shutting down kind of everywhere at the same time. So
Mhm.
those aspects, I think, are fairly unique. If you think about the aspects of countries confronting a flu or a pandemic, they're kind of on their own. They have to make their own decisions. They shut down at different times. They have different understandings about what causes it. The economy is shut off for a while. Those aspects at the level of sort of nations deciding on their own,
Mhm.
that all happened 100 years ago. And you could find that really everywhere you went. Individual countries or cities
Mhm.
making their own decisions about how to close down their city. And as you might know, that pandemic started in 1918. It started one. There's not real clarity exactly where it started, but one version is it started here in Kansas at a military base,
Wow.
Fort Riley, which is kind of by Manhattan, Kansas.
Mhm.
And so some people say that's the first place it appeared in the United States. Some people argue it might have been the first place it started anywhere in the world.
Mhm.
And then that was in March of 1918. So there was an initial wave that wasn't real serious. And so this same kind of talk, well, there's waves. So there was one wave. They didn't really have to shut much stuff down. And then there was a second wave in the fall and in early winter of 1918. And so cities in the United States were wrestling with, we've shut down in October. My own college, Bethel College, was shut down by the state of Kansas in October of 1918. And the war is still going on. So by November 11, people knew the war was going to end. There should be a big celebration. So you can imagine. So, in that way, you think, well, the Olympics is a big deal. Should we have postponed that? But imagine the end of the war, how people, especially on the side of the winning countries, they want to get out and
Mhm.
celebrate. So there was tremendous pressure to open up cities by November 11, right, the day that the armistice was announced.
But what made it that we didn't read enough in history classes about this pandemic? That's one question. And the other question is, what can we learn from it, or what connections can we make it with COVID-19?
Yeah, so I've wondered about that because when I wanted to talk with students about the Spanish flu, I thought, well, I should first of all see what's in the textbook in case they're reading things there about it, and I can point that out and we can make connections. There was nothing in the textbook that I'm using. So I looked at another textbook that I use with upper level students that focuses just on European history. It's also not in there, which is now super interesting because how is this possible? We don't know for sure the range of deaths from that Spanish flu pandemic was, the numbers kind of range between 17 to 15 million people killed, which would make it deadlier than World War One.
Hmm.
So here's a massive, massive killing event that is not reflected in kind of the ordinary history and in ordinary, well done history textbooks. And then you ask, so
Why so?
why is that? And so if you ask, I've asked some older people in the community. Turns out every family at least I mean, it's a very small sample, but it didn't take me any questions really to find people say, oh, you know, her sister's uh, uh, mother died, and I know this person who's, you know, whatever, they had this death in their family, and this wedding got put off, and it's alive in every family among the very oldest generation. So it's
Mhm.
survived completely in family history, but not in institutional history, not in the textbooks. And now I'm just speculating a bit because historians haven't had a chance to ask this question. It'll be really interesting, I think, to see what the next edition of these textbooks will be like and when historians will engage this question. But my theory is that that pandemic left no institutional trace. So there's no institution built to respond to the next flu pandemic. It didn't change the way public health functions. We can talk about the origins of public health and tracking diseases. It didn't change the way the US government or the state governments responded. I'm not aware of any response on a global scale. There's a brand new League of Nations. They don't take it up. They're worrying about the real things, you know, the important things like war and peace treaties, and this massive event that disrupts the economy and kills all these people does not provoke an institutional response. So,
And why do you think then why that happened to lack the institutional response for the pandemic? But we had the Great Depression in basically any
yeah,
book. We had the Great War in basically every book. The Second World War in every book. What's going to happen with COVID-19? And in that sense, what connections do you see, both on institutional level as a historian, but also drawing some conclusions from economic level?
yeah. So one thing to say about the Spanish flu is when it shut down the economy, and I think the economy is probably going to make the largest impact from COVID-19 when we look back. I think that's what people will really focus on. And the Spanish flu, the lockdowns were state mandated. I have not found a federally mandated lockdown, and they were relatively short. So Bethel College was closed once. This is just an example. Bethel College was closed for a month from mid-October to mid-November. Then they came back, finished out their semester in February when it should have been finished in December. Then they started up again, had to close in March, again for another month, and then they finished out in June. So if you think about that disruption, it's much less than what we're doing now. Bethel closed in the middle of March, and you know, we're closed through May, and we're not quite sure what will happen next.
So do you think that we learned something from it?
Well, you know, the thing that we've learned from that is nobody thinks we're going to get anywhere close to 50 million deaths. And of course, we don't know that the diseases have the same fatality rates and all of those other things. But we've really, there were probably 60 million Americans were infected. They couldn't do tests, but that's what they're guessing. So basically, we got very quickly to herd immunity in the Spanish flu, and all the people who couldn't make it just died. So what we've learned is there seems to be in the public health world a really strong understanding that we have to close down the economy to save lives. And they learned that lesson not from the Spanish flu probably, but from other 20th century pandemics that weren't as big.
Okay, now you made me raise another question. You have to close the economy to save people's lives, right?
Right. You have to stop social interaction, which has the impact of closing the economy.
Okay, so you say social interaction. Okay, that's another word that literally translated here is like we need to socialize, and luckily today we have the means of doing that, like you and I are socializing now.
Yes.
But if we're talking, you have to close down the economy to save people's lives. looking at today, who is doing the best job in that? And how can you explain that? Is it Europe, US, the US, or in Asia, China primarily, or who is doing the best job in either saving human lives or saving the economy? What is the priority, historically speaking?
Well, there'd be other people much better informed than me who could talk about who's doing the best job today. I think you can look at these charts and show where the most deaths are and so on, and get a sense. Some countries are doing pretty well, and some countries are not. Historically, maybe one thing we can think about is what's new is this is the first time that trade-off is being made consciously, because in all previous attempts, people didn't understand enough and didn't react quick enough that it was even a choice. By the time they started closing down individual states in the United States, we were already in the second wave. And one presumes, although there's no testing, of course, at the time, that it was really quite widespread. So that would be another thing we could think about. We're in this unique situation where we now consciously imagine this trade-off. And it's not clear what people would have done in World War I or in other situations.
And what is in your opinion then? How can we compare today's situation in the sense of, we have the internet, we have ability to communicate like this, but we cannot produce, and this is nothing like economic crisis, right? Still,
right.
The economy is still not really hit hard, right? So, but with what can we compare it? Can we compare it with a world war? Can we compare it with another pandemic or another disease, or what can we compare it from history?
Yeah. So again, I would think about what are the elements of this current experience that are like elements elsewhere, but I think, and I want to talk about some of those different ways to break that down. I think we'll come to the conclusion that it's the unique combination of what we're in now that makes this unprecedented. But if you think about, so for example, let's talk about economic destruction and breakdown. I don't know the global figures offhand, and of course, the Serbian economy is a story for itself. But if we look at some of the bigger economies, so you think the Great Depression, the Great Depression in the 1930s destroyed the U.S. economy. It cut it about in half. It did the same for Germany. And in Great Britain, it reduced it to about 75. No, Great Britain was about 90% of what it was. France was about 75%. So Germany and the United States were impacted by far the most by the Great Depression, and the size of our economies, the measurement they used at that time was just industrial production, was cut in half. And then you look at sort of preliminary talk now. I think the Chinese economy contracted maybe 7%. In the first quarter. That's still not an annual result. And the Great Depression lasted. It took it probably 2-3 years to reach the bottom, and then it took at least a decade to recover. So let's talk about economic destruction. Of course, we don't know what's coming now, but it's really kind of unfathomable that we'd get to destroying half of the GDP in the United States or even in any single country. But we don't know. But it sets a kind of a benchmark. Like, when are things as bad as the Great Depression? We're a long ways from there. We could maybe compare it to the Great Recession, 2008. That shrank the economy of the United States a couple, 3%, I'm not sure.
Well, more or less worldwide.
Yeah, more worldwide, right. So we might, China's a little worse than that. Economic data is not out. So we might be a little worse than the Great Recession. We're a long ways from the Great Depression. So, economically, just to kind of give us a sense of where we're at, we're like, yes, we should be really worried, but no, it's not nearly as bad as what we have survived in the past. Then, if you think about war, there's a couple of things. Obviously, you can think about the number of people killed. COVID-19 is pretty severe, and people talk about this in the United States. COVID, the virus has killed more people than soldiers were killed in the Vietnam War or soldiers that were killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. So in terms of just killing people, it's fairly bad. But for U.S. casualties, of course, those were quite small wars in terms of US soldiers killed. We're still a long ways from the impact of the really big wars, World War I or World War II, or the Vietnamese casualty count in the Vietnam War. So,
but for us in the Balkans, it's a totally different story, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, you might think about the war experience there is much more recent, and I think there too, just the killing of the wars in the 90s was higher than what you're getting from COVID-19. So again, you would say on the scale of, if you think of wars as mass casualty events, COVID-19 is not going to get there. The place where we are in a war, I think, is in the way the governments have now regulated our lives. So this is the same. In a wartime, the government tells you there's a blackout, there's air raids, go to your shelter, you have to do this, you can't go wandering
out. There's
curfew, you have to close your store. In this country, there's debates about, can the government force companies to manufacture ventilators or masks? And all of that happens under wartime powers. It's laws that were created to fight a war effectively that give the governments power to do that. So in that sense, we are at war, and we are required by our governments now to do these things. Now we might say in the public interest, but really it's a national security question. And the idea that the government has to protect people in a war is being carried over into the government has to protect people in the face of this infection. So we've all gone to war, which is kind of interesting. And I haven't seen too many commentaries talking about the fact that that's the sense in which we're at war. Our governments now have more or less complete control over every aspect of our lives and our society.
But you lived also in those kind of societies where the governments did control a lot. So I see behind you a flag of DDR, right?
Yeah.
So when did you live there, and how can you compare that experience with this situation as well? Is it comparable, and to what extent?
Yeah, there's so first of all, I lived in East Germany from 1988 to 1991, which is complicated history. So the first year I was there, it was East Germany, and then the government kind of went away because some of us were out on the street protesting against it. And then there was a year where it was a democratically elected East German government. And the last year I lived there, it was a part of a united Germany. So one thing that immediately strikes me as quite different is that we still have free media, and we can, we get a lot of different variety of information. In East Germany, you really only got one single source of information, which made it impossible to really tell what's going on. In some ways, we have so much information, maybe it's hard to tell what's going on, but that's a very different circumstance. But in terms of, when I lived in East Germany, I was told I could go anywhere I wanted in East Germany, but I lived like a 5-minute walk from West Berlin, so I couldn't go there.
Mhm.
And
Well, but we cannot walk outside now
yeah,
where we want to,
exactly. That,
especially after 6 p.m. In Belgrade, Serbia, or the whole Serbia.
yeah. So in that,
And we cannot go to Hungary now. Cannot go anywhere.
right.
We're locked in our countries.
That was East Germany. You know, you were locked in your country. You couldn't go anywhere. I mean, we could at least go outside, but you couldn't. Well, East Germans, yeah, it was a little. Actually, East Germans had more freedom under the worst of communism than we have now in terms of freedom of movement.
Oh, isn't that
It,
interesting?
that is really interesting. But again, you know, we don't think about it in those terms. We just accept it because now we know that that's public health necessity as opposed to a communist government
Hmm.
political
Hmm.
directive, what they're just doing to preserve their power.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I've
If
often,
we compare pandemic, that's where we were with the war situation or the
yeah,
Great Depression, and if we look at casualties, as you said, one measure of comparison, or one way to compare the severity of pandemic and with wars is the number of casualties, right? For the
yes,
U.S., it's worse than the war in Vietnam or Iraq, right?
right,
But for
yeah,
Europe and especially for the Balkan countries, it's not even close.
right, yeah,
So the perspective there is definitely different, right?
yeah.
So can we say that there is more fear in the U.S., or is it this American attitude, we can beat everyone, something that's a game changer there, or where do you see potential for, I don't know, coming out stronger from this pandemic, for who? US, Europe, Balkans, China. I don't know. A lot of questions, I know, but
Yes, yes. Well, I would say I don't really sense much fear in the United States.
Mhm.
I think there's an appropriate amount of caution. Um, and of course, everybody has elderly people in their family. So you worry about, in my case, you know, I worry about my parents-in-law. They're in a facility for the elderly. We know those things are really dangerous. So you know, people are prudent. I wouldn't say that the United States as a whole is fearful. Um, there, it's a little hard for me to tell. Again, I would say if we want to look for what is going to come out of this that will strengthen the US or Europe or the world, I think, are we going to build more sensitive and sensible institutions or not? And I think it's a little early to tell
Hmm.
how that will play out.
What do you
Uh,
mean? What do you mean by more sensitive and sensible institutions?
yeah, so you could find. Well, let me just go through a little bit of a list of some well, pandemics in my lifetime, not in yours. Uh, but so in the United States in 1976, there was an outbreak of something they called swine flu that started at a military base, Fort Dix in New Jersey. And they think maybe it originated there. And they feared that it was going to be, you know, a global pandemic. So they ramped up, they created vaccines, they started to require Americans to get vaccinated. I don't know how the world responded to this. I mean, it started here and we had the biggest response. Then they released some vaccine. I mean, they started vaccinating people without doing complete testing, or there were just some things they couldn't find out. And so the vaccine actually ended up killing 450 people. It caused a syndrome that left some lasting damage. And the swine flu on its own kind of fizzled out. So maybe that was maybe the best they could do at the time, but it was a kind of an overreaction. So that made people say, ah, let's not worry about these things. Then in more recently, there's been a South Asian respiratory syndrome pandemic, SARS, that came out in 2003. There was H1N1
Mhm.
flu that came out. That was about 10 years ago.
Yes.
That caused 12,000 deaths in the United States. So that was pretty serious. After that, then we started to build in the United States. There was talk about connecting this to our Centers for Disease Control, which is the main kind of national federal institution to look after infectious diseases, um, and to try to build some capacity there, or just to pay some attention. But it did not get, so it's embedded in a federal agency that has a lot of other responsibilities.
So it's just a one part of much bigger
Right,
system.
exactly.
And what you're saying, it's your concern is more about institutionalizing those kind of things. Is the awareness of the federal government in the U.S. Be much higher because of, let's say, COVID-19 now, especially to be prepared for maybe something new. But in Europe, we have those institutions, but also we have worldwide the World Health Organization that
Right,
watches that, right? So
right.
isn't the point of globalization, and the U.S. is one of the leaders in globalization, to connect everyone so we can all communicate, do business, grow, right?
Yeah,
Exchange knowledge. And inform each other if there is a new disease coming out and what measures do we need to take.
right. So I would say you always ask way too many questions. I can't answer that many at once, but I would say, if you think about WHO, for example, the World Health Organization, or the United Nations. I mean, it's a part of the United Nations. So we all know that system doesn't really work very well. You can ask people in the Balkans their experience with the United Nations in the 1990s. Do people think, oh, that really worked well? When they came in here, they really took good care of us. I mean, you won't find anyone who thinks that. So the reality is, I mean, I think that's a good aspirational goal. The reality is those institutions at best can coordinate among willing national actors. And if your
Mhm.
national actors are not willing, there's nothing the UN could do. So for Europe, if you really want to coordinate things, the question is going to be, what is the European Union going to be able to do? And that, I think, is still a very open question. Is the UN cooperating well? Depends on if you ask the British or, who do you ask? So
Mhm.
the UN, the European Union has a lot of challenges. And if you'd ask the Italians now, I think they'd say, well, at the end of the day, nations are kind of left on their own. We don't get enough help quick enough.
Mhm.
So if you want that kind of aspirational goal, you'd have to work at decreasing national sovereignty in the EU and increasing European cooperation, and that's a very big order. The question
Mhm.
is, if a common defense doesn't make that possible in the EU, which it hasn't yet,
Mhm.
uh, the economy might. That's been the area on which Europeans have been willing to give up the most and cooperate the most. So if they see this as an economic issue, maybe it would be incorporated in a more central place. But again, the issue is if you have an institution that's looking after the health of your people and it's not tied more directly into the key decision makers, uh, in Europe, that would be economic policy. In the United States, we might talk about its own federal agency, which is what we did after 9/11 and those terrorist attacks. We created a
Mhm.
Homeland
Homeland
Security
Security.
Agency. And so there's an agency that is now, at the top of the level, directly reports to the president, has lots of direct connections to Congress. It can't just wander off and disappear, which is what happened to our unit in the Centers for Disease Control. It atrophied. No one paid any attention because it was too far down, that it just disappeared. So I would say, the EU should have, a cabinet level or a pan-European level public health office that could address these things, including pandemics. That would be a
Mhm.
sign of real systemic change that would help for pandemics.
So basically, what I'm getting from you is again two things: people and the economy.
Yes.
And what changes or major changes in the economy have we seen in the past, in the sense of what changed in the industries? So, what can we maybe predict that now will change, or should we expect that this pandemic is a game changer for all of us?
Um, I as a historian, I would just say I think it's too early to tell. The Spanish flu pandemic changed nothing in the economy that I'm aware of. Not one thing.
Okay,
Closed it
okay,
down, opened back up. But it
okay.
was fairly short and somewhat localized, not as global.
What
Uh,
about the Depression, the Great Depression?
well, so yeah, so what the Great Depression changed a lot in our economy. I think on a global scale. I think globally, um, well, I mean, good grief, the Great Depression changed so much you hardly know where to begin. But just in the economics, I mean, it played a huge role in starting World War II, and that led to a whole other set of things. Without a Great Depression in Germany, it's hard to imagine the Nazis would have come to power. The Great Depression radicalized politics in Europe. Germans and others were voting in greater numbers for the Communist Party in the Great Depression in different countries. Um, and we've maybe seen a little bit of that. But that would be something to really watch. Will this economic crisis mean that voters turn to more and more radical solutions? And will it endanger democracy? That was one of the outcomes of the Great Depression.
Well,
Uh,
we have people now complaining about their freedom rights
yes.
in many countries because of the measures that governments are
Yeah.
taking due to the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah.
So, is this what you're saying? This parallel that we could maybe draw and be careful of?
I would think so. So you have to the other parallel from after the Great Depression was a sense of in some countries, blaming other people or blaming other groups.
Hmm.
Why doesn't our economy work? The Nazis, of course, were happy to blame the Jews, even though it had nothing to do with it. And I think there was a kind of a general rise among some people in Europe and certainly in the United States in anti-Semitism, xenophobia. We want to be more isolated. We can't trust those people over there. We have to hunker down. And I think in this, this sense now that, well, the Chinese are hoarding all of the personal protection equipment, or they did this or that. And I mean, there's all kinds of talk floating around about other groups that are doing things. And so a sense that we have to just look after our own nation or our own people. That might be an outcome of this that would parallel what happened after the Great Depression. And as we know, that ended up being terribly, terribly destructive. So that's a real cautionary tale for me.
And considering all of that and your knowledge of history, and you mentioned earlier that we now have access to more sources of information than we used to, especially when you lived in East
Yeah.
Germany. Uh, do you think that the world's view or our civilization is more mature than back then? That it's not as easy to blame you for us being, I don't know, hit by COVID-19, or Chinese or others to blame for anything else? Do you think are we more mature for that? And do we think that yes, obviously there is a need, and we talked about it when it comes to manufacturing industry. The supply chain is now endangered because
Yeah.
of the globalization. Everything is produced in China. Do you think that our mindset is not quite there yet to really get shut down, although we're kind of shut down?
Hmm.
Does it make sense?
Yeah. Uh, well, I'm I'm not real sure, where this will end up. Um, uh, and it's a little hard for me to say yet. Um, I would say the I'm not that optimistic that we're necessarily become better people in the sense that we'll resist those temptations. One hopes, that you've learned from history, but I'm a little pessimistic about that. And um, one of the reasons is if you go back and read the accounts, even in ancient history, so you can go all the way back to Athens, which is kind of in your neighborhood there. Uh, they had a plague in the Peloponnesian Wars. This is in 430 BC, so we're talking almost 2,500 years ago. And the initial reaction, was kind of panic. What do we do? It was very disruptive. People were kind of running around at a total loss. Um, and you can find that kind of reaction. So in a way, like these people who want to say, oh, it was these people's fault, or we don't know what's going on, or we're not going to take care of the whole group. We're going to take care of ourselves. I don't really care about public health. I just want to go out, to Ada, or I want to go out to the beach in California. That
Mhm.
reaction, I'm going to look after myself first. You found that in Athens in 430 BC. You find that in the accounts of the plague of the Black Death in 1348 from Florence. There's some really graphic accounts of what happened. Public order broke down, and people just looked out for themselves. So
Mhm.
I would say, to me, I'm not so sure as individuals we've improved much. I think that's an open question. The
Mhm.
place we really improved over all of those more ancient stories is in public order. So when you think, I mean, to me, it is kind of, I mean, there are people protesting, but you think about the potential, right, for public violence or even just defiance or riots among neighbors. None of that.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think we have a much this might be what people have understood. Yeah, we do actually have obligations, even when the government's not looking to
Mhm.
look
Mhm.
after each other. I feel pretty good about that. Some of the individual responses I've heard, make me question if we're making much progress as individuals. But I think as an
Mhm.
organized society, we're doing better than we've done in some cases in the past.
Mhm. And when where do you see the opportunities here, or do you see any opportunities for our civilization? Is it evolving, changing? Is this going to influence the change? You said it's maybe a bit early for that to say
Yeah.
now, but where do you see opportunity, if any?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity. Um, and again, I'm probably going to think a little more on a macro level than so much for individuals, although we could get to individuals from this conversation perhaps. The other thing that happened after the Great Depression, and I think the biggest impact from this pandemic is going to be in economics. So I think the Great Depression might actually teach us more than other pandemics. The
Hmm.
other really big thing that happened out of the Great Depression, on the other side, we got xenophobia and World War II. On the other side, um, we developed in the United States and reinforced in Europe the idea that the government can play a meaningful and useful role in regulating the economy. Europeans had figured that out after World War One because World War One dug so deep into all of European society, and it was really just a peripheral kind of thing in the U.S. We were in the war very short.
Hmm.
But in World War II, I mean, so first of all, the Great Depression built a lot of social network in the United States that did not exist, and
Hmm.
it extended it in Europe. And then World War
Hmm.
II demonstrated that the governments can run things effectively, and after World War II to provide for all of those tremendous needs of widows and orphans, and I mean Europe was devastated. governments were just much more active, even on the capitalist side. Of course, the communist half of Europe was a very different story that probably isn't going to apply to us going forward. So if we look at the capitalist side, the old idea, and this is what you're getting in this, I have to be free to do my thing. That would have been an argument from 18th or 19th century capitalism. You're best off, society's best off when individuals have maximum freedom.
Mhm.
And we've tried that out at different places, and I think there's a lot to that theory. Individual freedom is really important. But I think looking at those kinds of challenges that don't respond well to the market, which is what public health challenges are, we've found a better balance between individual freedom and responsibility and government playing a responsible role when needed in crisis. And so I think we could use a little more of that. Um, uh, and we hope it doesn't doesn't get out of control and become too much government. But I think we could use some more. And I think
Okay,
this,
I'm biased now a little bit, but I have to say this. This all sounds what you're actually teaching. This is the mindset that you're talking about, and this sounds to me like what you're teaching your students. Not only you, but majority of professors at Bethel College are teaching your students. Is like it's very important to have that individual freedom of thought, of critical and creative thinking. And we're here just to guide you to find your way. So in a way, I could explain you as also my professor at one point.
yeah.
You were more like a government, like that responsible government, giving me
Yes,
the framework
right,
and letting me do my thing.
right,
You wanna do your seminar on this topic or on that topic? Okay, why? It's not
yeah,
don't do that, do this, and do it from my book. It's like, okay, why so? So in that sense, I see a lot of potential in this crisis because what we all did, we reached out to each other, not only within our nations, rather globally. Okay, we have the internet.
right, right.
Uh, so we started there to exchange thoughts, opinions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would or what could make this change to continue to grow, in your opinion, and looking from the history? What kind of mindset we need, and can we expect a cultural change, global cultural
Mhm.
change?
Yeah. Well, I'm very reticent to say what we might expect in the future. I would say I think people are going to be much more comfortable. This really sped up the process of doing things online. We're
Mhm.
going to see much more of that, I think, much more, which makes it much easier to cooperate. So I have students from 3 continents now sitting in on my online classes because international students have gone home.
Mhm.
So I I think that will develop, and I hope this to me will be the kind of which way are we going to break off of this? Will we become more nationalistic and isolated, or will we become more globally minded? That to me is still a very open question, but the potential is there. So what will happen? How will history remember it? History doesn't remember, at my level where I teach it across centuries. I don't remember what individuals do so much. I look at structures and institutions. So that's what history is going to remember. But we certainly have lots of opportunities as individuals to play our part in deciding which way we want to go from here. And
Mhm.
do we want to engage more and push more and do more, or are we going to follow these other voices? So
Mhm.
individuals play a role, of course, and it's the cumulative actions of individuals that actually shape the institutions that historians then are more likely to remember and look at. So all of those institutions were formed by individuals making choices, but it's a
Mhm.
little harder to get down to that level of history.
Mhm. So we have individuals that changed or at least that's the history how remembers them.
Right,
We have
right.
individuals that changed the institutions, that changed the nations, that changed the history. What do we need to do? I mean, we don't. I don't feel necessarily that the history needs to remember George Maricic,
Right.
in particular.
Yeah.
But what can we do to maybe support someone else to do that, to be memorized like that, or what can we do individually to influence this cultural change, learning from the history?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm a big fan of international exchange. So I think, I still encourage my students. I mean, now obviously we can't, but I'm trying to find ways to get students out of the U.S. to see a different culture, and I always welcome people from outside the United States to come here. As you know, the U.S. looks much different living in Kansas than it does from a TV screen or a movie screen in Serbia. So we just, and vice versa, of course, is true. So when we need to get out and experience more. And I think those international exchanges are crucial, and we need more of that. And so whatever we can do to encourage individuals, to push our schools. I've worked some with Bethel to increase that, but resources are maybe a little bit limited. It's not everybody can do everything. So I would say pick one thing you can do that pushes in the direction of more international cooperation, and resisting the call, to really hunker down as a nation now because of COVID-19. We can't really trust or cooperate with others in the same way.
So you see their potential in exchanging, the cultural exchange, the international exchange on all levels and in all shapes. Well,
Absolutely.
that's great, and it's also great because we have Emir Janic joining us. He lives in Zagreb. He studied at Berkeley in California. He got his PhD. Emire, what is your opinion on hi Emire, what is your opinion then on this cultural change, and listening to what Mark Jansen had to say about history and international exchange?
Yeah. Thank you firstly for calling me and inviting me to participate in this excellent conversation. Mark, I'm really honored to meet you for the first time, of course. I'm very curious about history, regarding the fact that sometimes we think it's only a social construction,
Yeah.
It's only something that we agree upon and maybe have a different opinions on it. What I would like to ask you sincerely, I've been listening not from the beginning, so sorry about that, but rather from maybe 30 minutes after you started. And what I would like to ask you is on the ground of economics. So we know that historically economic pie is growing. So at the beginning of 20th century, the economic pie was much smaller than we have it today. Therefore, economic outputs are different as well. So regarding the fact that at the beginning of 20th century, you mentioned the Spanish flu had a significant influence on a certain social assumptions that continued on to 20s of last century, escalating with a Great Depression on completely other side of social impact. And then Second World War, everything happened so quickly and escalated as well up to today. Our economic pie today is much bigger than it was in the last century. Therefore, what do you think, how are we going to, live up to the end of this crisis regarding the fact that now we have much better conditions, economic conditions. We are not facing hunger.
Right.
We are not facing the threats that were very imminent 100 years ago. Are we going to jump over it and survive it without maybe some big repercussions on our civilization? Are we going to become better, more united around it? I listened to your comment on European Union, and this is on a track of integration. So are we facing a new integration that is unprecedented historically, or are we facing a dividing of our small cultures into something that is dangerous for our survival?
Well, my answer is I don't know. I think that's the path.
We can imagine.
Yeah. I think that's, at the big level, the macro level, that's the question that we're on. And of course, it's not a new question for the EU. The EU's been asking that question ever since they were founded, really. A sense that they need more and more integration to survive and to be viable. And where, are they willing to go to the end game on that? Or can they find some stopping point and be satisfied? And I think what this pandemic does is really sharpen that question and make it much more urgent. But I can't tell that it's going to tip the EU one way or the other, because you always hope, that people will be more empathetic. But then they run into, even with this is the part we were talking about a little bit earlier. This is the part about individual human nature that maybe has not changed so much. So the ancient response to plague was run away, look after yourself. And that's a kind of a shorthand for, does the EU want to integrate more and look after everyone, or does the EU want to, and other nations in the world want to look after a smaller group of people and not worry about everyone else? So I think human nature hasn't changed that much. And therefore, I really have no idea how that will play out. But I think the question is well formulated. That's what we have to look for.
Mark, if I remember correctly, your interest in the Balkans was more on a personal level than that you studied in the US. There's not much to study about the Balkans per se, maybe not in so many details. What kind of opportunities do you see, or do you see any opportunities for the Balkan countries now with this situation? Looking at history and of course the trends.
Yeah. Wow. The Balkans is such an interesting place. So what's really interesting to me about the Balkans is that
you lived just for the viewers. You lived in Belgrade for 3 years.
I lived in Belgrade. Right? So I lived in Belgrade from 1993 to 1996. And I was working with a relief organization that was related to a church, working with refugees mostly from the war in Bosnia. But after that, I went and studied, and I did some graduate work in the history of Eastern Europe as well. So, but the Balkans, in that sense, is like a microcosm of the world. So they're really divided into very small groups. But if you come in as an outsider, you can say, wow, here's a lot of things that look very similar. But you can also, when people point out, but this is different and this is different, you're like, yeah, you're right. That is also very different. It's harder for an outsider to see those differences than the similarities initially. So part of it is, again, sort of figuring out, where are those differences? Why do they matter? How do they play out? I think if you step back and ask, it's clear that the Balkans would benefit from more cooperation But given that the history and the reality of difference, that is too tall of order. Maybe it's a matter of looking for good partners in other directions, across other borders. I think in some sense maybe the Slovenians have kind of done that. But anyway, that all gets to be very complicated, and it's at this level, of course, that the history really matters, because you can't just say it'd be so much better for us to get along, when the reality is that's just not how that's not the hand that history has dealt you. So you'll have to work harder at that. We have our own challenges on it on different levels, of course, in the United States. The history of race relations, for example, in the United States.
History of what?
Race relations. How we have treated blacks and Hispanics, Native American.
Oh, you treated them?
Yes. Yes, or mistreated them. That's our version of a history that everyone knows we have to solve, and we have not, and it seems we cannot. So it's not like the Balkans is alone in these kinds of challenges. It's just a different hand that you're dealt with.
And it's a bit different narrative in that sense, and maybe a persistence of focusing on differences rather as disadvantages, rather on differences as opportunities to learn from each other and to grow. Mark, what you also said about the Balkans for this situation, I actually think that it is a great opportunity. Emir, myself, and a couple of other guys are trying to do that. We're trying to connect those dots and say, okay, I really don't care much about those differences, or actually I do, because they're enriching me and everything that we do together. Emir, what's your view on those opportunities? I mean, you also lived or studied in the U.S. and you moved a lot around. You live in Zagreb, where your roots from, how do you see that as well? And how can you explain an American who lived in East Germany, broke the wall down, and then in United Germany, and then in Belgrade during our Great Depression?
Let me just correct you. I studied in Slovenia, but my mentor was from UC Berkeley and
sorry,
school as well. Georgie and I really clicked very, very quickly. As soon as we met, I think that we became, let's say, good conversation partners. And what I feel is that we have an amplification system and mechanism, social mechanism, that is driving the differences, and it is historical, of course, like anything else. What I see now is also, initiation of different social mechanisms driven by event that is called coronavirus. There are many historical moments that led to similar changes as we see today. I like to draw a ball to my part of field, so I always love to see things from cultural perspective. And if we see the culture as a set of assumptions that are answering the basic questions of what is good, what is evil, who is enemy, who is friend, some really basic questions, then I see all of those events as a organization or as a cultural intervention events that changes those assumptions very quickly.
Yeah.
It all depends on the intensity of event. It all depends on how that event reached the population, how it drives things through the social network, etc. And having said that, I would return to what George said a moment ago. And this is how I see things. I see things as a set of very frequent events that happened in this region of Balkan that draw our different social networks to confront rather than to cooperate.
Mhm.
In the moments we have been cooperating, but we felt that that cooperation was driven by force rather than our will.
Mhm.
And that drove us in a position where we saw each other as a, let it not put an enemy, but as a competitor on the
Mhm.
same football field. And this football field is very small.
Yeah.
Having said that, it all contributes to the fact that we live in a quite small corner of the world, very much competitive about everything, and very much looking to gain from each other's. I see that especially this crisis that is not driven by our interest, but rather came from another, point of the universe, gave us an opportunity to see things differently, to find common grounds rather than differences. And I think that Georgia thinks similarly about this. It will and it can drive change of assumptions to a much more positive side
Mhm.
than we had an opportunity to feel it historically.
And we'll have to ask Mark next time he comes to our neck of the woods, because usually Mark is trying, as he said, to bring students or to expose students to other countries, other cultures, especially European culture. And since I've graduated from Bethel College in 2007, well, but even before that, he was bringing students to Belgrade because he lived there. And with that in mind, as well, and you said now you have students from 3 different continents. Mark, just to wrap it up, what is the future of schools? What is the future of colleges, universities now, from your perspective with this COVID-19? How is this changing educational system? And can we see any parallels from the past, or with the past, with history?
I'm going to say I just cannot think of any parallel in the past with what we're doing now. All these schools shut down and going online, it's completely unprecedented. I can think of no parallel. What will be constant, I think, are the economic forces on education in the United States. That is different in Europe, where education is mostly funded by the state. In the US, it's a much more competitive field. All the states compete with each other for students, as well as with a much larger number of private schools than exists in the US. So exists in Europe. So we're very competitive. I think economics will really drive it. I think students are either going to, I think students are going to come away valuing personal connections more. That's one option. And so there'll be less interest in online education among some students, and a real desire to connect with professors, because people are just kind of struggling in online classes. And that's my experience with students, and they acknowledge that it's easier when we're together and they have a kind of a personal contact. Other students are going to value the convenience of just checking in whenever. So I think there's going to be a sorting out in the United States, market driven by student preference, which is mostly just adding or accelerating that new option of online education. But there's some students who are not going to like it and who won't succeed at it. So I think there'll always be a role for face-to-face. European education, I'm not sure how that's going to go. What I've mostly followed sources in Germany, and I have a daughter who's actually living at home and taking online courses at Wuppertal University. in Germany. And what I have seen is at least the Germans are very poorly prepared for this, much less nimble than we were in the US on this particular point.
Mhm.
And it would take, so I don't see it changing much of how Germans do things unless people get much more up in arms about how that's gone. If it would continue longer, I don't know. I don't know anything about how it's played out in the Balkans. What's your
Mhm.
experience been there on that?
Mhm. What I would like to ask you for the very end is, um, for me, experience studying at Bethel College just strengthened and enforced the necessity of critical and creative thinking. How can you share that with others, or why should we at all consider going to college now when it's just a piece of paper? It doesn't necessarily mean that when you graduate with a business degree that you really know how to run a business, or any other degree. It's you need to get your master's, then your PhD, or your postdoctoral studies, or I don't know, just inherit a lot of money.
Right, right. Yeah, inheriting money is a good option, but I missed that chance.
From that.
So um, I would say the piece that's missing in education, and that's been driven especially in the United States, but I think it's coming to Europe as well, is this sense that education is an economic investment that must produce a return economically. And as you know, if you think about the German word for education, Bildung, that would have kind of two ways to translate it into English. One would be education, which is the usual way it's done. The other is formation. And so this aspect of education, it does actually form your character, or if you want to even go into neuroscience, it forms the pathways in your brain in a particular way. We know exposure to language, to music, to literature actually changes your brain. I tell my students writing things down by hand changes the way your memory works, makes it more efficient. So there's a lot of ways in which education is forming people that is crucial, but it doesn't have the same kind of direct economic payoff that you get when you have a certificate and they give you a job and a paycheck if you can do the job or not. So that's a constant. So we actually have to educate people about education, and we've done a terrible job of that in the United States. I think it's more embedded in European culture. To value, well, yeah, it depends a little on where you're at.
Well, I could say at least from my perspective, I didn't have to buy your book to have it signed by you and to repeat each line as you wrote it in your book. That's what I can say, and that's what I've been hearing from a lot of people. Not all professors are like that in Serbia, but I've been hearing that story a lot. If you want to pass my class, you need to buy my book, have it signed by me, of course, newly edition, not the not the secondhand one, and you need to repeat my sentences. So in that sense, I could say at least what I really appreciated, and I still appreciate it, is that you like to be challenged. Professors at Bethel College like to be challenged and see what we can bring as students. So, and it is forming. And thank you for being that influence, that little influence in my life as well.
Well, and it's always a two-way street. I learn something every year from students. That's what makes it fun. So. Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. I hope we'll be able to talk again, maybe to expand this topic and move in different directions. I fondly remember how you made us in class to think about the success of Martin Luther and his teaching of or interpretation of the Bible. and maybe I can even connect it with today's situation because of the internet and everything. So maybe things will change. Maybe we'll come to a better future.
Yeah, we hope so.
Emir, I thank you also for joining. Mark, stay safe, and thank you all for watching Business Talks. We'll continue next week as well.